Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I am Deacon Tim O'Donnell, Program Director of the Harvard Catholic Forum. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second lecture in our series devoted to faith and science. We are very excited to be launching the Harvard Catholic Forum this fall. The Forum is a project of the Harvard Catholic Center, St. Paul Parish in Harvard Square, and the St. Paul's Choir School. Our mission is to share the riches of Catholic thought and culture with the academic, professional, and artistic worlds of Cambridge, Boston, and beyond. In addition to our lectures, we offer non-credit courses, and in the future, we'll be offering other programs drawing on the breadth and depth of the Catholic tradition. You can support our ongoing mission by going to our website at www.harvardcatholic.org/forum and signing up for our emails about future events. We will provide a link in the chat function tonight, making it easy to do this. You can also help us by making a financial donation there. Tonight's event will be archived on the Harvard Catholic Forum YouTube channel. If you like what you see and hear, please share the link to that channel with friends, colleagues, parishes, or chaplaincies who may be interested. We are honored to have as our co-presenter for this series on faith and science, the Lumen Christi Institute. Since 1997, Lumen Christi has been enriching the intellectual and cultural life of the University of Chicago and beyond with the insights of Catholic thought. We are also pleased to have as co-sponsors the Society of Catholic Scientists and the Science and Religion Initiative of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. After tonight's program, you will receive a questionnaire. It would be a great help both to us and to our friends at Lumen Christi if you would give us your feedback. Tonight's lecture aims our attention at the very beginning of the Bible, the accounts of the 7 days of creation and of Adam and Eve in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. We encounter here a treatment of creation, but one very different from those developed by modern science. And so we are pressed to ask the question, what are these foundational passages telling us in our scientific age? And there is no one more capable of giving a rigorous and illuminating answer to this question than Father Richard Clifford. Now, before I introduce Father Clifford, let me give you a roadmap of tonight's event. Father Clifford will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we will have an opportunity for some questions and answers. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to send it to us. Father Richard Clifford is a Jesuit priest. He received his PhD in ancient Near Eastern languages here at Harvard and is an internationally recognized authority on the Old Testament, the literature and culture of the ancient Near East, and the Christian Bible. Father Clifford is Emeritus Professor of Old Testament and former Dean at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. He has been President of the Catholic Biblical Association and General Editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. Among his dozens of books and articles are commentaries on many books in the Old Testament, as well as monographs such as his groundbreaking creation accounts in the ancient Near East and in the Bible. Father Clifford, will you unmute and turn your video on?
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here in this distinguished series to talk to you about creation, both in the Bible and at least some indication of creation in the modern scientific view. Now, a large number today of scientifically aware readers appreciate biblical creation accounts as stages in humanity's quest to understand its origin, but not as sources of important truths for personal and communal life. Biblical accounts often serve as contrasts for what people today believe. But Jews and Christians instinctively know that the accounts contain wisdom, but they are unsure how to unlock the wisdom hidden in these texts. Early 20th century Catholic attempts to explain them are untenable today. But since that time, Catholic biblical scholarship, with the full encouragement of church authorities, have come to appreciate the literary genres that biblical scribes employed in writing these accounts, what the ancient scribes were interested in communicating, and equally important, what they were not interested in communicating. This evening, I would like to share with you some scholarly insights regarding creation. I will focus on two of the most well-known creation accounts: the seven-day creation account in Genesis 1, which we're all familiar with, and the story that immediately follows, that of Adam and Eve. They are fascinating, and they have something of value for our personal lives. Unfortunately, the seven-day creation account is often regarded as offering a view we have gone beyond what people used to think until science came along. And as for poor Adam and Eve, they are more often the subject of cartoons than of serious discussion. The first step toward understanding the creation account on its own terms is the first step toward understanding the creation accounts in their own terms is to be aware of the differences between ancient and modern accounts. I will mention four differences. The first is the process. Ancient Near Eastern peoples generally imagined creation accounts on the model of human activity: constructing a building, begetting offspring, a king uttering decrees, a king defeating an enemy to the human race and being acclaimed king on his return. Creation can be modeled on a natural process as well, such as an egg hatching or on a little hillock left behind by the receding Nile flood from which life forms emerged. That would, of course, be Egyptian. Some cosmogonies, some creation accounts, involved personal wills in conflict. A famous example is a Mesopotamian story, Mesopotamia being the area that is today basically Iraq, but the home of two great civilizations in the ancient world. The name of this story is Enuma Elish. And in that story, a vigorous young god, Marduk, goes out to meet a monster in the shape of a sea, a malicious beast who threatens the stability of the universe and terrorizes the assembly of the gods. Marduk finally defeats Tiamat and returns home and is acclaimed king of the universe. Marduk, the god, then creates the universe by splitting the vast body of Tiamat in two, the lower half forming the earth, the upper half forming the heavens. The victorious god then creates the human race and issues decrees that will henceforth regulate the course of the world. The imposition of order out of chaos is one way of describing creation. In contrast to such variegated creation stories from antiquity, derived from observable models of bringing order out of chaos, are modern theories of creation. Far from being modeled on human making, they are impersonal. They assume creation is often the interaction of physical forces taking eons to unfold, sometimes billions of years. And of course, modern theories reject any psychologizing of the process. The most significant difference between ancient and modern creation stories, is the result of creation. Unlike most modern thinkers, ancients did not primarily think of the solar and astral universe when they thought of creation. On the contrary, the term of creation for them was human society organized for the service of the gods, often including kingship, language, agriculture, in short, culture and crafts. Modern people, on the other hand, usually restrict the final act of creation to the physical world, typically our planet in its solar and stellar systems. This is the reason why modern cosmologists frequently rely on astronomical calculations to come to their conclusions. Human community and culture do not usually come into consideration. And if life is discussed, it is usually life in its simplest biological sense. Two more differences between modern scientific theories and ancient stories follow from the two just mentioned. The first concerns the manner of reporting. Ancients tended to use drama, stories, to describe creation, whereas scientists use scientific reports, which we are all familiar with. Scientific reports assume usually an evolutionary perspective, in a simple way anyway, primitive to more developed, simple to more complex, and are decidedly impersonal. Scientists offer fresh hypotheses to take account of new data, whereas ancients simply devise stories or varied existing stories when they wish to explain a particular aspect of their world. It is not easy for modern people who typically regard a story as entertainment or illustration to take the story itself as a carrier of serious meaning. Yet for the ancients who saw creation as involving wills, story was a natural way of reporting it. Perspectives were conveyed by the selection and omission of narrative detail and by varying the plot. So ancients' toleration for several versions of a basic plot is traceable to this understanding. The fourth difference between ancient and modern perspectives is the criterion of truth of a creation accounts. Modern people expect an account of creation to explain all the data and to be compatible with established existing theories. The ancient criterion of truth, on the other hand, was compatibility with ancient tradition and dramatic plausibility. Drama selects, omits, and concentrates. It need not render a complete account. A creation account, therefore, can be about a single reality and leave others out of consideration. Equally important in recognizing, before we come to a creation account, equally important is to recognize the scribes' purposes in composing creation accounts in the ancient world. They were obviously not interested in giving a literal description of the origin of the world exactly as it happened, for they preserved widely different accounts. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 are very, very different accounts, and they're not compatible. Science as a category of knowing was unknown. Rather, creation accounts in the ancient world were meant to explain an important reality by describing how it originated when God or the gods created the world. For example, the lengthy Akkadian poem Enuma Elish, which I've already mentioned, provided the rationale for how the god Marduk became supreme in the Babylonian pantheon, rightfully inheriting the authority of an ancient god called Ea and legitimating Marduk's present creating of humans and issuing the decrees that regulate the course of the world. The details of the story could vary, but the aim to glorify and legitimate Marduk did not vary. I want to apply this last point that I've made, the purpose of biblical accounts, why scribes bothered to write them, to the two biblical texts we will examine this evening. In the opinion of most scholars, the original purpose of Genesis 1, the 7-day creation account, which we'll talk about first, was to respond to a terrible catastrophe that struck Israel in the 6th century BC. The Babylonian army's destruction of the temple, which was the Lord's house, the holy city of Jerusalem, the Lord's own city, the killing of the Lord's deputy, the king, and the deportation of his successor, and the deportation, in addition, of a very large number of prominent citizens of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas to slave labor in Babylonia, Egypt, and elsewhere. These blows were more than simply physical catastrophes. They evacuated of meaning the sacred traditions that had animated and inspired generations of Israelites prior to this. And they seem to suggest that the people would die out in the exile and that their God had proven to be a failure. He could not rescue them. So the disheartened exiles or descendants of exiles seems, in the opinion of many scholars, I'd say most scholars, to be the original intended audience of Genesis 1. And I think we today we don't suffer from the catastrophe perhaps of the 6th century, but we are looking for meaning, and we are often at times saddled with doubts about God's power and efficacy and presence. So we can read these stories with equal access as the original hearers of them. So Genesis 1, I would argue, was meant to reassure the exiles that their God was still all-powerful, that he intended all human beings as nations to live life fully, or in the words of Genesis 1, to increase and multiply and to have their own land, fill the earth and subdue it. How important this message must have been to Israelites far from their native land and anxious about whether they would survive as a people. The biblical author describes the origins of the human race to ensure the people that their God intended them to live and to flourish, and that rescue would come. The purpose of the Adam and Eve story, which we'll take second, is a little less clear. It may simply be an exploration of the limits that humans must live with. Limits that are both agricultural. Why is it so difficult to run a farm, to herd and to raise crops, and to process the clothing and the food that comes from those lands? And anthropological. Why is it often the case that humans in their daily life, in their raising families, face such formidable problems? And it may be that how to explain the difficulties and the limits of life in the light of the Israelite belief that their God was a God of kindness and of love. So let's now go to Genesis 1. And I am going to simplify matters a little bit by giving you a kind of shortcut. Let's see if I can get this up. This is an outline of Genesis 1. And as you can see, it makes the Genesis 1 is a rather formidable text to read, but it can be graphed in such a way as to grasp it rather quickly. As you can see from the outline, the creation account is framed by pre-creation chaos in the top and post-creation order in the bottom. Now, creation itself occurs in two panels, days 1 to 3 and days 4 to 6. In the first panel, God creates the three domains of earth, sea, and sky. And in the second panel, God creates the mobile inhabitants of those three domains, each inhabitant moving through its medium with animals, with fish with fins, birds with wings, and humans with their legs. So the story basically defines life as self-motion. If something moves on its own, it's alive. Now, I'm just in analyzing this text, which has generated hundreds and thousands of pages of commentary down the ages, I'm just going to concentrate on features that are most relevant to the text's intended readership in the future. Israel in exile, despondent and doubting God's power and care for them. So you have to figure, who is going to read this originally? Who are the scribes writing for? I would suggest that they are writing for people in exile far from their homeland, seriously doubting God's presence, God's power, humiliated because they see, in their understanding, they see the gods of Babylon, or the gods of Egypt, as the gods who really control the destinies of human beings. These are the gods who are with their hands on the levers that shape human history. But this Genesis 1 is an attempt to explain the present reality by explaining the origin of things and to explain how God acts in the world. And so it's really a portrait of God acting. The one's first impression of Genesis 1 might be of a rigidly fixed universe. The freshly created world is anything but static. Its dynamism reveals who God is. Day and night are in dynamic opposition, perpetually alternating. The waters of the sea surge and lapse Earth's beaches, but do not overflow it. Sun, moon, and stars are fixed in the sky, giving light and directing life. Above the sky and below the earth lie unimaginably vast bodies of water. Fish swarm and swim, birds fly through the air, land animals are constantly on the move. Humans range freely over the three domains authorized by the Creator to make it flourish. And over everything and with everything is a God who wanted it all to happen. God's noble experiment becomes increasingly complicated as Genesis moves on and as the biblical books tell further the story. But the human beings are mentioned only briefly here, but later we will know they will attract successively God's fascination, God's anger, God's compassion, and God's love as generation succeeds generation. So the author of this piece, or the authors, perhaps there were more than one, were, instead of simply telling Israel to cheer up and things aren't that bad, they rather described God acting in the world authoritatively at its very beginning, and they communicated the message that the world indeed makes sense, that God is in control. Our God, the God of Israel, is in control, and that God who was so intent on imparting life and order at the beginning will eventually come back and impart life and order to us, even in our misery. Now, even though this creation account communicates something important about God, we must not forget that biblical creation accounts differed from modern ones in envisioning a human community as their conclusion, rather than the astral and solar universe as is common today. A distinctive feature of Genesis 1 is God's decision, after consulting with his assembled servants, let us make human beings in our image after our likeness. What does that mean? What does image mean? And how would image be an encouragement to a people that are scattered and dispirited? The church fathers of the first 5 centuries interpreted image, and they were fascinated with it because it had kind of Platonic overtones, which attract, and many of them were much influenced by Platonic philosophy. They interpreted in what has been called a substantialist way. In other words, they interpreted the image of a human being in some way as mirroring the destiny to which the human being was called, and in some ways imitating the very being of God. And I'm not going to go into it because that really is a study in itself, but it was really therefore connected with the structure of the human person. And that was more or less common among the fathers of the church in the first 5 or 6 or 7 centuries. And that then became a traditional Catholic way, a Christian way of interpreting human beings. But since the Reformation in the 16th century, there is another meaning, another interpretation that is, I think, increasingly common, and I think it doesn't displace the first, but it does, I think, add a good deal of meaning. And that has been called a functionalist interpretation. In other words, the scholars today are more inclined, especially Protestant scholars, are more inclined to study the image of God as functional. And it refers, therefore, to the task of ruling. In the royal imagery of Israel's Egyptian and Mesopotamian neighbors, when Israel borrowed heavily from their neighbors in many ways because they were an ancient Near Eastern people, image can be used, as Phyllis Bird says, to designate someone who is understood to be a special representative of the god or gods, possessing a divine mandate to rule and hence divine power, but who is himself neither deity nor divine. You can see that it's a dense sentence, but it represents the image. A king might be ruling a vast territory and cannot go there, especially in that world of lack of means of travel, but would put up an image of himself or an image of a law code to indicate to the people in that area who he was and what he wanted from them. And so Israel here, I think, is being called anew to its vocation, even though they are in a position now where they do not seem to have much to say to the nations about their God's grandeur and dominion. Their vocation in the long run is to proclaim the Lord's sovereignty among the nations. And that vocation of Israel, I think, is particularly amplified and developed by Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, where Israel is called to be a covenant people and a light to the nations. And I think that perhaps Isaiah 40 to 55 and Genesis 1 were written more or less the same time and to some extent had in mind the same audience. We come then to, I think, another creation account, and I'm going to just go back to myself, okay? And this is the story of the man and the woman in the Garden of Eden. I say the man at this point. Technically, Adam, the man is called the man, and he's only called Adam in chapter 4 of Genesis. But because everyone calls this Adam and Eve, I am going to yield to the crowd and also call him Adam even before he's named Adam. So the Lord creates the man, Adam. He plants the garden in Eden with the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Then God appoints the man as gardener and gives him leave to eat everything except the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and bad, because the tree of the life doesn't really, it only occurs at the beginning and is briefly mentioned at the end. They're really concerned about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, good and bad. Observing, now here's one interesting point to keep in mind in looking at Genesis 2 and 3. God is a keen observer of the man. It's as if God made this wonderful creature and has not yet experienced fully what this creature will do. And so God keeps on observing what the man does, and then finally what the man and the woman do. So notice this as a feature of the story, because it does figure in the interpretation. God observing that it was not good for the man to be alone, God creates the animals from the earth. Observing again that no animal proved to be a suitable helper for the man, God creates the woman from his rib. On seeing her, the man rhapsodically declares her to be the one for him, and he gives her a name, woman from man. The wordplay works in Hebrew, and it also works in English, ish for isha and man for woman. The couple are naked, though, without the usual accompaniment of sexual arousal. I'll return to that later on. At this point, enter a snake, not a serpent, because serpents are not found in gardens, at least in the gardens that I've seen in my brief experience of agriculture. And it's certainly not Satan, because Satan in the modern sense doesn't appear until centuries and centuries later. It's simply a snake. It's the wisest of the animals, and it also has the unusual capacity for a snake of standing up and being able to talk face to face with human beings. It's the wisest of the animals. The snake persuades the couple to eat the fruit of the tree, which, the snake says, will open their eyes and make them like heavenly beings who know good and bad, that is, who know everything. The couple's eyes are indeed opened when they eat the fruit, but they know only one new thing: they are naked. God investigates the transgression, he curses the snake, and he assigns new destinies to the woman and to the man. He does not curse the man and the woman. He curses the ground because of them, and that curse is later lifted. But he really gives them new destinies. The man then gives his wife a second name, Eve, mother of all the living. I think that's very significant. He names her twice. Once he names her woman because she came from man. This time he calls her Eve, which is a derivative of the Hebrew word for life. Eve, in view of her new maternal role. God clothes the couple with leather, that is permanent garments, and expels them from the garden, setting armed cherubim to guard against their re-entrance. Now, the story is a lot to take in, I admit that, and it's not a simple story. It may help readers to recognize two before and after scenarios shaping the story, one agricultural and the other anthropological. Before the couple, let's look at the agricultural scenario first. Before the couple sinned, agriculture consisted in the man tending a vast garden irrigated by a mighty stream flowing up from the deep and branching into 4 great rivers that fertilize the earth. It's paradise for a farmer to have that unlimited amount of water and to have already a garden, a huge garden already there. After the sin, however, the couple was expelled into a new agricultural system in which the man will laboriously till the arable soil dependent on uncertain rain. Israel was never a great place to farm, at least in biblical times. The soil had been there from the beginning, of course, but it was dormant. This is an important point. It was inactive. It was dormant. Why? Because the Lord God, according to Genesis 2:5, had sent no rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. Now, the anthropological scenario, which is the second of the two scenarios shaping the structure, concerns the people's human nature and their defining tasks. Before their sin, the man and the woman enjoyed fullness of life and knowledge simply by being in the presence of the living and the wise God. To be sure, they were not inherently immortal, like heavenly beings, formed as they were from earth, nor did they have the wisdom of heavenly beings. But such limits did not matter as long as they were in God's garden. After the sin, death, and here in the sense of living outside Eden, living outside the sphere of life. This death, in that sense, was imposed on humans. Humans now had a lifespan. Now, creation stories such as Genesis 2 and 3 invite many questions. Here are 6, and I'm going to give the question, and then I'm going to give at least my answer, which may or may not satisfy you, but it satisfies me at least at the time being. Is the garden important in the story? And yes, the answer is yes, because it is the part of the palace of God. Gardens of gods and kings were exceedingly important institutions in the ancient Near East, well into Islamic times. Their plants and trees symbolize creativity and fertility. The 4 rivers fertilizing the earth are essential to the story also, for they symbolize the intense vitality emanating from the garden. The man and the woman did not need to go outside God to enhance their life. There's another reason why the garden was important. It is sacred space. It was an extension of God's house, and it required strict protocols for human behavior. All expressions of sexuality and all vestiges of death were excluded. This is not because it's anti-sexual. It's because God is above death. God is eternal. There are no signs or vestiges of death or of disease should come into the divine world. And that's why. So you had to, people had to conduct themselves very carefully in God's house. Secondly, what is the meaning of the 2 trees? Though the narrator tells us there were 2 trees, the man and the woman and the snake speak of only one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And I'll limit myself to that tree alone because I think it's the only one that plays a role here. The trees, however, are metaphors for the 2 qualities that in the ancient Near East chiefly distinguished earthly from heavenly beings: immortality, the tree of life, and super wisdom, that is the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Good and bad here is what is in biblical terminology called a merism. It's the 2 extremes that signify the whole. For example, I searched high and low for my watch. It means I searched everywhere. I searched the 2 extremes, high and low, young and old, that kind of thing. So that's what it means. It really means all knowledge, at least in my opinion, that's what it means. The stories from Israel's neighbors in Iraq, in what is today Iraq, tell us how the gods gave humans a certain degree of wisdom, but in all of these stories, with one exception, they withheld immortality. The third question: why did God forbid the couple to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and bad? God's prohibition is usually seen as an assertion of divine will, reminding the couple that humans' first duty is to obey God even when no reasons are given. But an explanation that is more closely tied to the story is also possible. God's command was meant to safeguard the wisdom the couple already had by being in God's presence. It's like a command that you give a little child who is playing near an electrical outlet. You tell the child not to get away from that. But what you really meant is, I don't want you to be hurt by what might happen to you if you stick your hand in that electrical outlet. So that's the tree of knowledge, therefore, was forbidden to the couple for that reason, I would argue. At least that's the reason I think that makes sense. It's also because it is a test of obedience. There's no doubt about that too. Now, why did the man and the woman not die when they ate the fruit? God said to the man, on the day you eat from it, you shall surely die. Well, first of all, on the day is simply a Hebrew idiom for when. So it's never meant to be taken literally. But you shall surely die cannot mean that the man will die upon eating the forbidden fruit, for he lives to be 930 years old. That's pretty much the refutation of that interpretation. Nor does it mean you will become mortal, for the man was already mortal by reason of being made from earth. The meaning, in my opinion, can only be that the man's sin will end that nearness to God that made him fully alive, despite his being made of earth. When he leaves God's garden where life abounded, death will eventually come to him. As 3:19 says, dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Another question, the 5th question is, why are the man and the woman naked and not ashamed? Now, some scholars have noted that Eden depicts the childhood of the race, for only children are naked and unashamed. It's quite true. Yes, this couple's sexuality had not yet been awakened, but that fact must be put into a larger context. In the agricultural scenario that I mentioned before, when the soil outside the garden was originally dormant because the Lord God had not caused rain to fall upon it, and there was no man to till it, the soil was dormant, in other words. But when the man left the garden to till the soil became activated by the man's tilling it and the onset of rain. Something similar happens to the procreative aspect of the couple's sexuality. It was dormant at the beginning of the story, indicated by the couple's unashamed nakedness. As long as they were in God's garden, They did not have to worry about procreation of children, for life bloomed everywhere. Indeed, they could not have exercised their sexuality. In the Bible, sexuality is the remedy for mortality, because no elements of sex or death were permitted in the sacred dwelling of the eternal God. But once expelled from the holy garden, they had to exercise their procreative powers and beget children, for they were no longer in the life-imparting presence of God. The interpretation I just gave, while not a common one, has the advantage of explaining a puzzling feature of the story. The man names his wife twice. The first time in 2:23, when he calls her a woman from man, and the second time in 3:20, when he calls her Eve, because she was the mother of all the living. The man instantly knows what God has said when he said, you're going to have to bring your children. He knows that that's going to happen. So he says, I'm going to give you the name that is appropriate for you. Now, inquiring minds, and this is the big objection to my theory that I just gave you, inquiring minds will no doubt ask, if the couple had remained forever in Eden with their procreative powers dormant, how could they have had descendants and the human race expand? In other words, we wouldn't be here today listening to me, and I wouldn't be here today talking to you. The answer lies, I think, in understanding the way that God chose to relate to the couple. And here I would go back to my first comment about this story, that God is a keen observer of the human race, and God responds to what God sees. In other words, God sees the aloneness of the man and solves it by making animals. Then he sees that the animals will not relieve the aloneness of the man, and he solves that problem by creating the woman from the man's own rib. And I would suggest that this problem that we see today as resulting from their being forever in the garden of God would have been resolved by God in the future. In other words, God is endlessly inventive and can respond to any issue or problem that arises. And God, in this case, I would say we should have confidence that God would resolve that issue in God's own way. Remember, it took, but I think we cannot apply to God the philosophical categories that we drew, like omniscience, because you could ask this question, why did God not foresee that the man needed a woman? Why wasn't that clear to God at the very beginning? God had to wait for the human to live a while to see how this man would exercise his own freedom and his own nature before God could respond to that man. So you can't use these categories. And another one would be, why did God not foresee that the human race would become totally corrupt and avoid the bother of even creating the world? Remember that God comes in Genesis 6, God says twice, I made a mistake. I regret creating the world. It took God 10 generations of humans, observing them closely, to come to that decision. Why, if we use philosophical categories of omniscience, God would have not even bothered to make the world, because God would have known the world was going to be corrupt. It turned out that God's judgment was corrupt for the first generations, but with Noah, God created a new edition, so to speak, or began again, and this time it worked. The last point that I would make, and this is going to be the conclusion of the story, is what does the story of the man and the woman, the Adam and Eve, teach us today? Why, or another way of asking that is, why did the scribes even write this story? Now, my answer would be something like this. Living in the very dwelling of God proved too much for our inexperienced first parents. They had to leave it for a less intense environment. But they and we cannot forget that living with God in Eden, in God's very house, was what God originally intended for the human race. And we, poor banished children of Eve, ought never to forget God's original intent, or to lose hope that one day that intent will be realized, though in a different way. If the story teaches about God's high hopes and generous intent, what does it teach us about our parents' sin? When the snake urged the woman to eat the fruit so that she and her husband could be wise like heavenly beings, he invited them to go outside their relationship with God to acquire something belonging to another order of beings. Their act was an everyday thing, right? Eating fruit. Nothing could be more common. But it was representative. It was at once an act of disobedience, and it was also, I would argue, an act of idolatry. Now, disobedience is the more obvious sin. God had commanded them using the commonest Hebrew verb of commanding. The Hebrew word to obey is shamak. It means to listen. It means to listen to someone. It doesn't mean to obey a command in an abstract sense. God accuses the man of listening to the voice of the woman rather than to the voice of God. And so the couple went for the gift, and they bypassed and they defined the life. Let me go on to the idolatry. I would argue that the sin is also a sin of idolatry. The couple went for the gift, and they bypassed the giver, and they illustrated vividly what Hosea, a prophet of the 8th century, would accuse Israel of doing when he accused them of idolatry. Israel, God says, did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished upon her silver and gold that they used for Baal. The prophet Hosea indicts the people for seeking from other gods the benefits that were in reality gifts of the Lord. The man and the woman in Eden sought to be wise with heavenly knowledge instead of living on earth with God. Though the pair and all whom they represent missed out on the fullness of life and wisdom originally intended, they did come away with a lesser version of that. And the story ends with a loss, but not with an irreparable loss, for it's possible for their descendants to access the garden and the tree of life in the present, albeit in a diminished mode, by visiting God's dwelling, seeking wisdom, and living according to God's world. Expulsion from the Garden of Eden may have pushed the man and the woman into a harder existence, but it provided the human race with an indelible image of a future life with God. No wonder that the Christian vision of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 22 includes the tree of life. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Father Clifford. And the questions have been coming in. Let me start with one that showed up in a number of different questions. Most people who talk about Adam and Eve and that story talk about original sin. That didn't come up in your talk. Can you address that and how that relates to your interpretation?
Yeah, the original sin is it means a sin that was at the origin of the human race, that somehow the effects of that sin affects in a negative way subsequent members of the human community. It's important to recognize that is a basically interpretation that comes from the St. Paul in Romans 5 and in 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about Jesus being the new Adam, whose obedience brought us life, whereas the old Adam, disobedience, brought us death. And now that has been a very dominant interpretation in Western Christianity, in Western Christianity. It has not been a very dominant or very significant contribution in the Orthodox tradition, nor in the Jewish tradition. Jews tend to look at the impulse, the evil impulse that is described in Genesis chapter 6 as something somehow analogous to original sin. I'm not denying original sin. I think it's a legitimate interpretation of St. Paul, but it leaves clearly the parents here they're going representative figures. They're going to influence the way we look at ourselves. But original sin in the way it has been developed in the doctrine, especially from St. Augustine and in the Reformation, it was a very significant factor as well. I think we have to begin with St. Paul and work backwards into a Genesis 2 and 3, rather than take Genesis 2 and 3 and work forward. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but it's...
Yes, thank you. So an anonymous individual asked the following. It's a fairly long question. Other than the Genesis stories that you have addressed, I do not recall the Bible addressing being directly, except for God's "I am who I am" announcement and Christ's comment on Judas's existence, "It would be better that he were not born." Are there other passages wherein being qua being is addressed? As an aside, I've never fully understood Christ's comment on Judas based on my understanding that being is better than non-being. Could you comment on this as well?
Well, that's a hard one because it's asking a kind of philosophical question of a biblical statement. And the Bible, it's interesting. I just wanted to, in sympathy with the person who asked that question, the Greek translation of the I am who I am is haon. And people who know Greek will know that is close to being a philosophical statement. Is the being one. But for the most part, the Bible is interested in the action of God rather than in the kind of question, the kind of issue that would be connected with being in itself, which was a very great topic of great interest to especially Aquinas and especially to Thomas Aquinas and subsequently. But I can't help on the being, non-being. I mean, clearly the Bible is a book that champions life, existence, action, more than inertia. I mean, it's interesting that in chaos, this might be have some relevance to that question. Chaos in Genesis 1 and chaos in general in ancient Near Eastern creation accounts is not random motion as we think. We think of chaos as being a situation that's chaotic when people are running around not knowing what to do. Chaos is inertia. It's darkness. It's non-motion. It's non-light. And I think that might be one way of getting at the question that was asked, that God is the one who undoes that inertia, who controls the waters that are so uncontrolled they make life impossible. It is God who lights up the world. The first thing God does in Genesis in day one is to light up the world, not with the sun and the moon, but with rather the luminescence that comes from God's own being.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, good. Let me ask a detailed question, perhaps, but I think an interesting one. Why does the snake speak to the woman rather than the man?
Okay, this is now, I'm going to give an interpretation that is not everyone's, but I will give it anyway. I'll ask it this way. When God made the animals to assuage man's aloneness, one animal was created the wisest of all. And that animal we know from chapter 3, verse 1, was the snake. And the snake was therefore intended to be the helper fit for man, okay? But when man did not respond to the animals as assuaging his loneliness, his aloneness, God then looked again and decided to make someone from the man's own body, someone with whom there would be a kind of a sexual attraction. And guess who was passed over? The snake. The snake was passed over as a helper fit for man. So my suggestion is that the reason that the snake goes and speaks to the woman, normally in that culture, he would probably speak to the man first, right? He speaks to the woman because he wants to show the world and to show God and to show the man that that she is not a helper fit for man. She is the one who is a disaster for him. She leads. She's not a temptress, because the man is standing. They're together, right? They're standing at the side. The man is standing at her side, so she doesn't go and tempt the man. The man is as guilty as she is, but she is the one who makes the bad decision and decides to eat it. And so the snake is happy because he has shown that the woman is not the helper fit for man, that he was. So I take it that way. The reason I do it that way is because every good story explains motivation. And if you don't give a motivation for the snake, it's not a good story. And I can think of no other motivation for the snake than jealousy and envy of the woman. I think any child of 3 or 4 years old growing up in a house with 3 or 4 siblings would know exactly what I mean.
Give us something to think about. Deacon Edward Muntz asked, have you considered whether the nakedness of the couple was due to initial guilt in violating God's command not to take the fruit of good and evil? It seems to make sense that our concupiscence in recognizing the guilt of our actions stem from feeling naked.
Well, that's a kind of extension of the problem with that is that it comes to that interpretation comes a little too late in the story. The man and the woman see each other for the first time, and the man declares the woman, just this is the at last is someone that I've worked for, before there's any kind of interaction between them. And this text tells us that they were both naked and they were not ashamed. It does shame there. I don't think means that sex is something shameful. It just means that I think it's another way of saying there was no sexual arousal. There was no sexuality, because that's what at that point, the marriage was for companionship. They were meant to be for each other. She assuaged his aloneness, and he presumably did the same for her, and that he thought she was the greatest thing ever to happen in his life. But sexuality and procreation were not part of their world at that point. Later on, it's going to be, she has the capacity to procreate, and he has the capacity to father a child. But at that point, that was not in their minds. At that point, they were concerned solely, I think, with companionship. So I know it's not. There's a variety of opinions on that and interpretations, but that's the interpretation that I think best, in my opinion, best fits the later announcement of God to the woman that she will then have to beget children in pain, and she would and in some danger, which of course was true in that culture in that time.
Good. Well, thank you. And just in general, so many of the things that you're saying are about taking the story seriously.
Yeah, that's
as a story, structured as a story with all of its details and its need for motivation and drama.
Yeah, we've tended to take it as we've read this somewhat through the eyes of Paul in the New Testament, which is quite legitimate to do so. But at the same time, it can obscure there's a kind of simplicity here. Even though it's a sophisticated story, there's a kind of trueness to people, the way people act. You know, that animals are never going to assuage the aloneness of a man. Mm-hmm. You just know that. They may love animals, they may think they're wonderful, but it's not going to be. It's not going to change your sense of that. I want someone to be with, mm-hmm. And I think that kind of down home, very sane, very human understanding of life and so on. I think it's all through this particular thing.
Good. So Marilyn Boussaid asked, in your explanation of God's reaction to Adam's requests, are you saying that God doesn't have perfect foreknowledge and did not have a plan of salvation in his mind before anything was created?
I would say that you can't. I put it this way: the philosophical categories of omniscience and omnipotence and so on, which we attribute to God in the Bible, are not always the best way of understanding the Bible. I think what I would say is that it isn't that God is not omniscient. It's rather that God enters so profoundly into the temporality and the finiteness of human beings that God is willing to wait and willing to learn and to see exactly how humans really behave. And I think that, to me, that's a much more consoling truth than to look upon God as knowing everything all the time, everywhere, because that's not the way the Bible portrays it. God waits, and it takes God 10 generations, and not 40-year generations, much longer, because people lived longer, to finally decide, I made a terrible mistake and my heart is grieved. You know, that's a remarkable statement by God in Genesis 6. It's said twice. We get the point. So I would argue with it that way, that God enters profoundly into the life of human beings and is willing to, in a certain sense, take a hit from that finiteness and that entering, because God is so committed to human beings and their welfare.
Good. So Peter Dodson asks, could you comment on why Genesis chapter 2 was written hundreds of years earlier than Genesis chapter 1? What was the motivation of this account? You had said quite a lot about the motivation of Genesis 1 and much less about Genesis 2.
It's a very good.
Didn't talk about that.
It's a good question. It's not clear. The Genesis 2 and 3 is part of a larger series of narratives that begin with Genesis 2 and 3 and end much, much later. They run through much of the book of Genesis and even into the book of Exodus and Numbers. And it's sometimes called the Yahwist source, or the J, because God is called Yahweh in that source. The Jews and most Christian scholars don't translate Yahweh. They translate as Lord. But that story, it's part of a larger story that originally was early, and I would argue that those stories at 8th and 9th century BC, because of the Hebrew style and the vocabulary and so on, and that the Genesis 1 is from another source, but someone has come along and edited these different sources into a coherent whole. And why Genesis, my guess would be that there were stories that defined the people that were current and that they were largely oral. And at one point, these stories began to be written down. We can't really trace it because there's no evidence of it. But I would just suggest that these stories once were oral, and they're shaped by oral too. You can see certain oral traits in them that shape it. And they begin to be written down, and maybe they're told because for people to be a people, they have to have a story. They have to have some way of talking about themselves and their history. And I would say these stories were written down for that purpose. Whether somebody really explicitly said we need a story like this, I don't know, because we just have the written distillate. We don't have the oral matrix that gave rise to it. But generally, I'm a slightly old-fashioned. It's been revised by many people, but I don't think and great reasons. I think that J source would be like 8th or 9th century, 8th or 7th century maybe BC, and the other story would be several centuries afterwards.
Barbara Valukas asks, how does the concept of dominion impact our relationship to the earth today?
Very good question, and very relevant to the concern for environment. I think dominion there does mean, some people try to soften it and said, oh, it means just looking and contemplating. I think it means dominion in the way that a king has. God has dominion over the heavenly world, and God's servants, the heavenly beings, have dominion over the heavenly world, and they run it, they operate it. And I think humans have an analogous task. They have dominion over the three domains of earth, sea, and sky, and it's up to humans to make sure that they are preserved as God made them, and that they are not abused, and so on. And I think that we haven't really understood fully and appropriated fully what dominion means. I mean, dominion means authority. There's no doubt about it. There's nothing wrong with authority as long as it's well used. And I think dominion there means caring for and seeing to the flourishing of the three domains of earth, sea, and sky, and its mobile inhabitants. So I think it's a great incentive to environmental care, and I think Pope Francis we should be grateful for calling our attention to care for the environment as a very important feature of Catholic social teaching.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. Okay. Thank you, Father Clifford, for your lecture and for the illuminating Q&A. Our virtual format does not allow us to clap, but I invite all to show your gratitude to Father Clifford by raising your hand on Zoom or liking the program if you were watching on YouTube. And we also encourage you to fill out the survey, which you will be receiving by email as a follow-up to this event. Remember, too, that you can help us in the ongoing mission of the Harvard Catholic Forum by supporting us financially through our website. Please note, this Sunday, November 1st, Lumen Christi is presenting the distinguished historian, Father John O'Malley, University Professor Emeritus from Georgetown, in a webinar entitled Venerating the Saints, an Ancient Tradition, Actual Today. Details and registration are on the Lumen Christi website. The Harvard Catholic Forum's next event on November 14th features John Allen of Crooks, renowned reporter and commentator on all things Catholic, speaking to us from Rome on COVID-19 and the worldwide church, please join us. You can register on our website. And thank you again for joining us in this conversation. Have a good evening.